Libya on the brink of civil war. After some of the worst violence since the revolution, foreign leaders warn the fighting poses a threat to the entire region. Is Libya on the verge of collapse? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, it's the worst bout of violence seen in Libya since 2011, and it threatens to destabilize the whole region. Over the weekend, an umbrella group of militias from MISRATA and elsewhere captured Tripoli's international airport. It follows 5 weeks of fighting with a rival militia from ZINTAN for what's considered one of the most strategically important places in the capital. But it could be seen as a hollow victory. After weeks of bombardment, the airport has been left in ruins. Well, the fighting in Tripoli is just one part of a much larger struggle for power that extends across Libya and beyond. For weeks, forces loyal to this man, former General Khalifa Haftar, have been fighting what they call terrorist groups in Libya. Now, militias opposed to the government in turn accuse their enemies of being pro-Gaddafi forces which seek to abort the 2011 revolution. Now, on Monday, regional leaders met in Cairo to discuss what they see as the potential spillover effects of the fighting in Libya. The leaders of Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan and Chad have called for an international push to disband the militias in Libya. Egypt's foreign minister led the call for regional action.
We have noticed for a long time the effect of the Libyan situation on the security of its neighbouring countries, with the presence of extremist and terrorist groups. Their operations are not limited to Libyan territories. They extend to neighbouring countries through the smuggling and trading of weapons, people and forbidden items, and the crossing of borders, which hurts the sovereignty of neighbouring countries and can eventually threaten their stability.
Let's bring our guests into the discussion now. We have joining us from Beirut, Anas El Gmati, director of the Tripoli-based think tank Sadeq Institute. From Oxford, Oliver Miles, former British ambassador to Libya. And from Cambridge, Jason Pack, president of LibyaAnalysis.com. Good to have you with us. If I could start with Mr. El Gmati, does the capture of Tripoli's airport take the conflict in Libya now to a new level?
Well, it's certainly a new trajectory in this quite painful new episode of violence that has marred the country over the past 3 months. And it's significant because, upon the capture of the airport and the ejection of the militias from ZINTAN, it's definitely symbolic, but it's also emboldened those militias and also those forces behind the militias to declare the GNC, the previous legislature in Libya, to come back into Paris. Now you don't have only 2 militias and 2 warring factions, but you also have 2 different legislative bodies, one with a marginal and even mildly popular seating and popularity amongst the people, but the GNC, which has been expired since the beginning of February, now coming back into the play. So it's very significant. It's quite an interesting development.
Does this mean that Tripoli, is it clear, is Tripoli now in the hands of anti-government forces?
Well, I think it's different. I think, try to paint MISRATA as, or those forces that are behind Operation Dawn, as somehow anti-democratic. I think in principle, a lot of those forces, a lot of the members that have signed up to Operation Dawn, because of the sheer polarization of the current episode, have not exactly chosen a side that is strictly for the objective of being anti-democratic, anti-government. I think what it is, it's a complete challenge against the current emerging status quo. It's most likely a certain response to the way in which Khalifa Haftar has tried to have a power struggle since the beginning of May. And I think in that respect, it signifies something that's just a bit wider than just narrowing it down to one strict objective. This is about trying to make sure that, on the one hand, the revolution isn't sold as they see it. It's also about trying to make sure that they also have financial and military, status in the new government as well. Because at this very point, there are no Islamists that are now in the current legislature in Tobruk. They've been marginalised. But at the very same time, the close and kind of kindred warmship towards Khalifa Haftar and Tobruk has kind of allowed this, this new image to emerge that is basically, if you're with the democratic process, you're also with Khalifa Haftar, you're also with this war on terror, and everybody is fair game. MISRATA militias, the Muslim Brotherhood. So you've got this wild kind of mismatch and hodgepodge of different militias and various interests, but they're kind of putting themselves as counter-revolutionary. Right. They're not saying we're anti-government, they're not necessarily saying we're anti-democracy, but they're in a very precarious situation.
We'll get into that in a moment, but if I could turn to Ambassador Miles, is Libya becoming a failed state?
It may do. I think that's still premature. I don't think it's a failed state now. The problem, I agree very much with what Anas was saying just now. The problem at the moment is a number of different forces, militias, which are looking for their own objectives, which are in conflict with each other, but which are not necessarily trying to overthrow the government. And there are positive developments alongside that. You have the new House of Representatives, which has been properly elected, as far as anyone can tell, which is now meeting in Tobruk and is trying to exercise authority. It has the problem which the previous government had, that it just doesn't have the tools to do the job. It doesn't have the leverage to control the militias, and that's the risk, that the militias will become mere warlords seeking their own advantage.
And if that happens, what does that mean for not only for Libya, but for the region?
Well, I wouldn't exaggerate the effect on the region. Of course, Egypt, for example, is going to be concerned, and the other neighbours, but particularly Egypt, because Egypt doesn't want to see the Muslim Brotherhood acquire a controlling position. They're neurotic about that because of the way they've been in conflict with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt itself. So there is concern, and justified concern, but I think the idea that Libya is somehow going to cause the whole of North Africa to burst into flames is grossly exaggerated.
Perhaps Jason Pack, we should keep in mind that life is already very difficult in Tripoli, if not in Libya as a whole. Power cuts, medicine shortages, just how unbearable is life becoming for people?
Well, this is a good question that's been undercovered in the media. There have been fuel shortages for months, rolling electricity blackouts. It's rare to have 2 or 3 hours of electricity in a row. Libya has become, in a way, cut off from the outside world, particularly in Tripoli and Benghazi. However, as Oliver was pointing out, it's best not to exaggerate things. Libyans have had enough food. Very few have had to become displaced persons. There has been a water shortage since the Misratans have conquered Tripoli 2 days ago. But people are getting by. They're going to private wells. And because Libya is a relatively wealthy country with decent infrastructure, we're not seeing a main humanitarian crisis. I want to jump back to some of the good themes that Anas and Oliver have brought up. If we look at the struggle in western Libya, Tripolitania, and the struggle in eastern Libya, Cyrenaica, we can see two primary cleavages. There are anti-Islamists who have become dominant in some parts in the east, and now we've seen an Islamist and their allied Misratan militia victory in the west that has almost cut Libya in two, back to its traditional cleavage between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. And as Anas wisely pointed out, these polarities between the militia movements are mapped in the formal political domain, which is that the elected House of Representatives, which is sitting in the extreme east of the country in Tobruk, has a nationalist, anti-Islamist majority, while in the west, the victorious Misratan militias are now trying to reinstate the expired GNC, which had an Islamist majority. So the polarization that we see on the militia level, we see geographically and politically. And this shows you how bifurcated or almost trifurcated the modern Libyan reality is going to be. And we have no idea how the victorious Islamist Misratan elements in the West are now going to push their advantage. What regional groups are they going to ally with? How are they going to change the administrative arrangements on the ground? It's really anyone's guess.
This is, perhaps take the question back to Anas El Gmati. This is part of the problem, really. The basic question is, what really is the conflict about? Is the sort of dichotomy that you sometimes hear, that this is, Islamic-oriented parties or groups versus non-Islamic-oriented groups, Democrats versus anti-Democrats, is it that simple? Or, I mean, there are regional tensions, long-standing historical regional tensions, there are economic grievances, are there not? I mean, is it just is it easy and accurate to just paint a very simple dichotomy and say, well, it's the Islamists versus the non-Islamists?
The binary doesn't necessarily, stand up to much scrutiny. It's definitely better than, Islamist versus secular or liberal. I'm not sure how liberal Libya stands up to scrutiny against many of its Western counterparts or other countries in the region. But in one respect, there is it's an ultra-conservative country. The shades of grey are not so many. Most of the country, or most of the people inside the country, are not really adopting very shifting left or right policies. To say it's Islamist versus non-Islamist, I think is probably the best way of going around it. But what does it mean on the ground, and what does it mean for militias?
What are people actually fighting over then? Why have we got some militias from MISRATA fighting militias from ZINTAN, if for want of a better term?
Well, I think as I think the best way of looking at this is it's based around grievances, around economic, around identity, around security, and around power, and those things were bound to happen given the vacuum of power that was left in the wake of Gaddafi's death. However, the real interesting thing is that this kind of vacuum is kind of transformed into a political free market of sorts. And when you really think about it, Libya's government is giving away a 50 billion lottery every year. I mean, that is its national budget. And unfortunately, we don't have these genuinely apolitical structures and these institutions that are immune from, being power grabbed by certain tribes, by certain regions. So in one respect, I think most of those groups on the ground that are fighting, particularly ones that have risen to the surface, they're fighting over very, very conventional and quite predictable financial and military resources. That is the main game in Libya today. When Haftar says that he wants to fight terrorists, I just don't buy it, strategically and objectively. And even the way in which he's trying to paint a narrative, it's so wide and it's so blurry, and in fact it's so dull and almost, it's just so clunky, it's not very precise, that you realise this is about trying to get back in the game since the political isolation law was passed in May of last year. On the other hand, when you look at the MISRATA militias, they also feel that, not only will the Muslim Brotherhood go down, but any other militia that is not with Khalifa Haftar will also lose out on this massive lottery every year. So when it comes down to these very conventional, very basic things, it's intriguing, and it's intriguing to put it in this kind of language, but it comes down to very conventional and quite predictable military and financial resources and objectives.
All right, so perhaps it's the result of a political failure to be more inclusive in the transitional process since the revolution. Ambassador Miles, once again, if we're likely to see, as seems to be the case now, maybe two different parliaments emerging, we've got the one in Tobruk, and it seems now one is being set up in Tripoli. Are we likely to have some battle for legitimacy on the international stage too, or is this simply leveraging before everybody will go back to forming another, national unity government?
I believe that so far as the international dimension is concerned, there's no contest. The House of Representatives, the newly elected House of Representatives, will be accepted by international opinion, by the neighbouring states and by others as legitimate, and the attempt to revive the old National Congress, whose mandate was originally a good democratic mandate, but which had expired. I think that attempt has got no credibility outside Libya. So I wouldn't see it as influencing the international picture at all. Inside Libya also, I doubt whether this will prove to be the issue. I come back to the point, and here I think I agree with both my colleagues in this discussion, that it's very easy to oversimplify this, and that what you're talking about is a lot of different forces, each of which has its own particular interests and its own particular drive, and they are to some extent regional, to some extent tribal, and to some extent ideological in the sense of Islamist against non-Islamists. But don't forget that when you talk about Islamist, of course all Libyans virtually would say that they are Muslims, and most of them would say that they want, nearly all of them probably, would say that they want a government which has some Islamic character to it. But they don't want the Muslim Brotherhood, many of them, some of them do, and there's also the extreme Islamic factions, the Ansar al-Sharia and the men of violence who exist, who are a problem, especially in the eastern part of the country, but which are not supported by the population.
All right, let's broaden the question out a little bit. Jason Pack, we're seeing regional leaders meeting in Cairo. Are we likely to see some new form of international or regional military intervention?
Well, that's a fascinating question, because maybe we've already seen that. As you may or may not be aware, 2 days ago was the second airstrike on Tripoli by unknown forces. And the first airstrike last week was clearly in support of the non-Islamist faction, and the head of that faction is the Eastern rogue general KHALIFA HAFTAR that we've heard much about. He claimed that he was able to carry out that airstrike. That is possible. He could have had his air force upgraded by Egyptian or Emirati help. He could have been operating in more westerly bases because he lacks in-flight refueling capacity. But it's quite possible that he claimed to have conducted these airstrikes, but his regional allies might have conducted them. So to sketch the picture, you see something in Libya which is not so dissimilar to what we see in Syria, a proxy war. And this adds yet another level of complexity to add with the good things that Anas and Oliver have already mentioned. Beyond the ideological dimension, you've got the regional dimension. Beyond the regional, you have the tribal. Beyond that, you have just a scramble for power. And like almost a rival criminal gangs, everyone wants to get the money from the government. But then you have this regional dimension whereby Qatar and Turkey support the Islamist factions, both from the moderates like the Brotherhood to the extremists like Ansar Sharia. And the Western nations, plus Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and the United Emirates support the anti-Islamist factions. You'd think that would be an unequal fight because all the Western countries plus some Gulf countries would be able to outmaneuver Qatar and Turkey, but that's not the case. The Qataris throw around their weight very, very well, just as they have done in Syria. And that's the regional component that we've seen since the Arab Spring, the opening up of a struggle for and against the Muslim Brotherhood and for and against certain jihadist groups, where one conflict that's happening in Egypt affects what happens in Syria, affects what happens in Libya. And with the ejection of Morsi and the Brotherhood from Egypt, Brotherhood elements very much want to cling on in Libya, and their Qatari and Turkish patrons are not abandoning them anytime soon. To sum up, this means that any international mediation conference, such as the one you mentioned in Cairo, has to bring in players from all sides. It can't be just the Egyptians, the Saudis, and some Westerners. We need to bring in the Qataris and the Turks so that they can have a real mediation, and both sides are present at the table, because one side
Jason,
is right
this
and no one
doesn't
side
look
is
like
wrong
a
in Libya.
mediation attempt. Let's not forget, I mean, we're seeing countries meeting here: Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Sudan, Chad. I mean, some of these countries, don't have a very good track record in human rights and democracy to start off with, and they're being cast in the light of being very anti-democratic and counter-revolutionary by their opponents. This doesn't seem to be a serious mediation attempt, does it? More than an attempt to perhaps intervene to help their allies in the region.
That's exactly right. All the states involved support the anti-Islamist faction, and you're right, they're not too bothered by democratic legitimacy. My point was that as we build on this going forward, and as it's time on Wednesday, there's probably going to be a UN resolution passed. And once the international community says, we have to try to help our Libyan allies, the key thing is not just to help the anti-Islamists. The ZINTANis do as much smuggling, and HAFTAR kills as many civilians as the Islamist-aligned factions. So Qatar, Turkey need to have a side at the table as well, so we can have real mediation between all of the stakeholders.
Well, you mentioned there the mysterious airstrikes, and they have repeatedly hit the MISRATA militia in recent weeks. On Saturday, the strikes killed more than a dozen fighters. The anti-government coalition of fighters blamed the airstrikes on foreign powers.
Based on the intelligence we have, the Egyptian and the UAE governments are directly involved in this heinous attack. We stress we have good relations with the good people of Egypt and the UAE, but the Libyan rebels want to make it clear that we will always defend the sovereignty of our homeland against this aggression.
Anas El Gmati, to what extent is the battle in Libya also just another extension of a regional battle between those forces which are pro-change, pro-revolution, and those forces which are opposed to it and afraid of it?
I think it's an interesting distinction, and in that respect, to add on to what Jason was saying, I think Libya's Muslim Brotherhood at least the perception is they're almost the last man standing. And in that respect, it really is a front. And as Uri already mentioned, it was the theatre of war, almost this proxy war in Syria. But I think in Libya, it just descended into this pantomime and a very obscure and almost laughable scenario, because at the very least, you now have two counter wars on terror in the same country. Now they're adopting the same narrative, Operation Dawn and Operation Karama. It is a very, very highly fueled, but also a very, very localized kind of battle. But both are offering cures that are actually worse than the disease. And so in that respect, it's almost laughable now to get to the extent where Tripoli is almost obliterated, or parts of Tripoli are obliterated, in this hope that somehow you can cleanse it from democratic...
Do you think, Anas, we'll see an Arab force, for example, an Arab military force being sent into Libya, maybe spearheaded by Egypt?
I don't think ground forces, though. I think there has already been some movement on the Egyptian-Libyan border to go and help Khalifa Haftar. I think that's probably from early as March, April, and they've already had some training received in the early days of March and April. But I think at this stage, airstrikes, sustained airstrikes may have worked, but the airstrikes that were carried out in the last week don't seem to have had or translated into the kind of influence that they wanted on the ground. But I want to make it very clear, airstrikes and a sustained aerial campaign would be a game changer in Libya. And in that respect, MISRATA would have to have a substantial amount of help, or MISRATA militias have to have a substantial amount of help from Qatar and Turkey, if they're the only allies that they have. I think in Egypt they have a partner with Khalifa Haftar. Egypt would be a partner for that kind of intervention. I think they have the appetite for it. But I think at what kind of cost, and I think at what kind of relationship. And I don't think at this stage, given Libya's long legacy of fascism, it breeds this kind of cynicism towards having international attention. NATO's intervention was mildly received, and I think it was good, but I think an intervention now by Arab partners would be looked at by cynically, even by supporters of Operation Dignity.
All right, I think we've got just a couple of minutes left on the show, so let me give a chance to Ambassador Miles. We know that the UN Security Council has been called upon by the Libyan government for intervention. What sort of Security Council resolution might we expect to emerge?
Well, I'm afraid it will be motherhood, as the Americans say. It will be a call for all parties to exercise restraint and so on. But before we get too excited about that, I would like to suggest that this part of our discussion has got slightly out of proportion to the rest. I don't believe that the airstrikes or foreign military intervention or foreign intervention of any kind is going to be the decisive factor here. I'm not a military man, but my impression is that there's very little that could be done by air power, even if you were to imagine a kind of rerun of a major operation with NATO forces and Arab League forces coordinated by the Americans, as we had in 2011. The situation is completely different. At that time, it was possible to intervene because the problem was that Gaddafi had heavy weapons, which he was going to move across long desert roads to launch attacks in a faraway part of the country. And that was a sitting target for air power. That's not the position at the moment. These airstrikes don't make any difference. So coming back to your question about the international intervention, I think the only thing that we can do, and when I say we, I mean Britain and other Western powers, but also Libya's friends, its neighbours and the Arab League, all we can do is offer support for the constitutional process, which is still alive, and that's what we should be doing. All
right, I could see Anas, I think we've got a brief minute left. I could see Anas was shaking his head in disagreement, so I want to give you a chance to express what it was you...
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, the militarily speaking, airstrikes would change the ground. That is, it could also lead to a stalemate, as what occurred beforehand. But even the threat of force at this stage, because there's no ceasefire on the ground, there's very, very little way in which incentives can be made to stop the current fighting. And I think I'm not
is there an appetite for it, Anas, as the Ambassador Miles has pointed out? No one wants to get involved, really.
I certainly don't think there's an appetite. It would be political suicide for a European country to try to get involved in the quagmire that Libya is now. However, Arab countries don't have, the same kind of democratic institutions and the same kind of accountability processes, and they may have already been involved. What we do know is there has been airstrikes. We're asking who it is, and I think a sustained campaign would change things.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, Anas. I have to cut you off there. Let's leave it there for now and thank our guests, Anas El Gmati, Oliver Miles and Jason Pack. And of course, you can let us know your thoughts too by leaving your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Sami Zeidan. Thanks for watching. For now, it's goodbye.